In the valley of Laconia, silence was not a sign of peace, it was a sign of compliance. But there was one room in Sparta where silence was heavy, suffocating, and terrifying: the chamber of the Gerousia. Imagine a stone room, cold even in the heat of the Greek summer, lit only by the flickering light of oil lamps that cast long, dancing shadows against the walls. In the center of this room stands a father. He is a warrior, a man whose shield has deflected Persian arrows and whose spear has tasted Theban blood. He is a man who does not know fear on the battlefield. But here, in this room, his hands tremble ever so slightly. In his arms, wrapped in a simple woolen cloth, is his newborn son. The baby is less than 48 hours old. He has not been named. He has not been officially welcomed into the family. In the eyes of the state, this child does not yet exist. He is merely a candidate, a biological proposal submitted for approval. The father steps forward and presents the bundle to the council of elders. These are the Gerousia 28 men, all over the age of 60, their faces maps of old scars and hardened resolve. They are the gatekeepers of Spartan genetic purity. They do not look at the father, they look only at the child. One elder, his hands calloused and rough, reaches out and takes the infant. He does not cradle it gently. He handles it with the clinical detachment of a butcher inspecting a cut of meat. He unwraps the cloth, exposing the newborn's naked skin to the cool air. The baby whimpers. The elder frowns. He begins the examination. It is a thorough, invasive, and heartless process. He checks the alignment of the spine, running a rough thumb down the vertebrae. He bends the legs, testing the joints for any sign of clubfoot or weakness. He presses his ear to the tiny chest, listening to the rhythm of the heart, searching for the slightest murmur, the faintest irregularity that might suggest a future inability to run in full armor for miles without collapsing. They are looking for perfection, but not the perfection of beauty, the perfection of utility. Is this biological machine capable of killing? Is it capable of dying without complaint? The elder lifts the baby high, turning him in the lamplight. He splashes the child with unmixed wine, a harsh, stinging test. It was believed that epileptic or sickly children would go into convulsions or fall into a stupor upon contact with the potent alcohol, while healthy ones would scream with vigor. The father holds his breath. If the baby cries out with strength, if his limbs kick against the elder's grip, he passes. But if he is silent, if he is lethargic, if his body shows a single deviation from the standard, the verdict is delivered with a simple nod. There is no appeal, there is no mercy. The child is handed back, not to the father, but to a helot slave waiting in the shadows. The destination is not the nursery, but the apothete, the place of rejection. The apothete was a chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus, a place of jagged rocks and howling winds. It was the dumping ground for Sparta's mistakes. That night, under the cover of darkness, the slave would carry the rejected infant up the mountain path. The air grows thinner, colder. The sounds of the city fade, replaced by the cries of wolves and the rustle of birds of prey waiting for their meal. The baby is placed on the hard earth, left exposed to the elements. There is no burial. There is no marker. The Spartan state does not mourn what it cannot use. This infanticide was not a secret shame. It was a public declaration of values. It shouted to the world that Sparta valued the collective strength of the phalanx over the individual life of a child. It was the first lesson every Spartan learned, even if they were too young to understand it. You do not matter. Only Sparta matters. But this brutal selection process began long before the child was even conceived. The state's obsession with genetic superiority turned the institution of marriage into a state-run breeding program. In other Greek city-states, like Athens, marriage was a contract between families for dowries and political alliances. In Sparta, it was a biological imperative. The state magistrate scrutinized potential matches with the eye of a horse breeder. A man who was too short could not marry a woman who was too short. The state feared they would produce kinglets instead of kings. They looked for complementary traits: strength to match agility, endurance to match ferocity. Love, affection, or personal preference were considered irrelevant distractions. If you fell in love with someone the state deemed genetically incompatible, you were out of luck. If you despised the person the state chose for you, you did your duty regardless. This control extended into the most intimate corners of life. The concept of wife sharing or husband sharing was not scandalous in Sparta, it was patriotic. Xenophon and Plutarch both describe a system where possessiveness was viewed as a vice. If an older man, perhaps a veteran whose body was broken by war, had a young, fertile wife, it was his duty to allow a younger, stronger warrior to impregnate her. He would invite the young man into his home, step aside, and allow the act to happen. He did not see this as cuckoldry. He saw it as securing a better heir for his house and a better soldier for his city. The biological father was irrelevant. The genetic output was everything. The woman, in this equation, was a vessel. Her health was prized. Spartan women were the best fed and most athletic in Greece, but only because a healthy vessel produces a healthy product. They were well nourished, not for their own sake, but so they could survive the trauma of childbirth and produce sons who would survive the trauma of war. For the boy who survived the wine test and the mountain, life began with a ticking clock. For 7 years, he lived in his mother's house. These were the golden years, perhaps the only years of warmth he would ever know. Spartan mothers were tough, they had to be, but they were still mothers. They fed him, they told him stories of heroes, they cleaned his scraped knees, but hanging over every moment of affection was the number 7. Everyone knew it was coming, the day of the severance. When the boy turned 7, the state arrived to collect what belonged to it. It was not a request, it was a seizure. There were no long goodbyes. A Spartan mother who wept for her son was shamed. She was failing in her duty. She was expected to hand him over with dry eyes and a stiff spine, telling him to come back with his shield or on it. The boy was taken from the warmth of the hearth and thrown into the agoge. This wasn't a school. School implies learning for the sake of knowledge. The agoge was a kiln designed to burn away the boy and leave only the warrior. On his first night, the reality of his new life crashed down on him. He was stripped of his tunic, his shoes, and his name. He was thrown into a barracks with dozens of other boys, a pack of wolves in the making. There were no beds. He had to walk to the banks of the Eurotas River and tear up reeds with his bare hands to fashion a sleeping mat. He was not allowed a knife. His fingers would bleed, sliced open by the sharp plants, and that blood on the reeds was the first offering he made to the state. He lay there that first night, shivering on the damp plant matter, surrounded by the sounds of other boys crying softly in the dark cries they would soon learn to stifle. The older boys, the Irons, patrolled the rows, looking for weakness. If they heard a sob, they struck. Comfort was the enemy. Comfort made you soft. Comfort made you hesitate. And in the phalanx, hesitation meant death. The agoge was designed to simulate the conditions of a campaign 365 days a year. They wore the same thin tunic in the blistering heat of summer and the freezing winds of winter to harden their skin against the elements. They were forbidden from bathing often, so their bodies would become accustomed to the grime and stench of the trenches. They were being systematically dehumanized, stripped of every individual comfort until their only source of identity was the unit, the pack, the state. And then there was the hunger. It was constant. It was gnawing. It was a physical pain that never truly went away. The agoge deliberately underfed the boys. They were given just enough black broth, a vile mixture of boiled pig's blood, salt, and vinegar to keep them alive and functioning, but never enough to feel full. A full belly was a luxury. A full belly made a man lethargic. A hungry man is alert. A hungry man is desperate. A hungry man is dangerous. But this starvation had a secondary, more sinister purpose. It was an invitation to crime. The instructors told the boys, "If you are hungry, eat, but we will not give you food. You must take it." Stealing was legal for a Spartan child. In fact, it was encouraged. It was a vital part of the curriculum. They had to sneak into the gardens of neighbors, into the marketplaces, even into the mess halls of the older warriors, and steal bread, cheese, meat, anything they could find. This taught them stealth. It taught them to move silently in the dark, to observe patrol patterns, to seize an opportunity and vanish before the alarm was raised. These were the skills of a scout, a spy, an assassin. The boys learned to walk without breaking a twig, to breathe without making a sound, to suppress a cough even when their lungs burned. But the catch was brutal. If a boy was caught stealing, he was not punished for the theft. He was punished for the clumsiness of getting caught. He would be whipped, beaten until his back was raw, and then cruelest of all, sent to bed hungry. The lesson was clear. Morality is irrelevant. Results are everything. There is a famous legend, perhaps apocryphal, but deeply revealing of the Spartan psyche, about a boy who stole a fox cub. He hid it inside his tunic to sneak it back to the barracks. On his way, he was stopped by an instructor for inspection. As he stood at attention, the terrified fox began to panic. It scratched and bit into the boy's stomach, tearing through flesh and muscle, burrowing into his intestines. The boy did not flinch. He did not cry out. He stood rigid, his face a mask of calm, answering the instructor's questions while the animal ate him alive from the inside. He fell dead only after the instructor walked away. This story was told to every generation of Spartan boys, not as a warning against stupidity, but as the ultimate example of discipline. To endure pain, to hide your secrets, to protect your honor even at the cost of your life, that was the Spartan ideal. While the body was hardened by hunger and cold, the mind was broken by fear and humiliation. The agoge was a psychological pressure cooker. The instructors needed to ensure that these boys would not just obey orders, but that they would obey them instantly, without a millisecond of thought or doubt. To achieve this, they destroyed the concept of the individual self. The boys were not allowed to speak unless spoken to. When they did speak, they were forced to be laconic, brief, concise, cutting. A Spartan did not babble. A Spartan did not use flowery language. A Spartan said yes or no, or famously, if. The older boys, the Irons aged around 20, were given absolute power over the younger children. They acted as drill sergeants and inquisitors. Every evening after the meager meal, the Aaron would call a boy forward and demand an answer to a question. Who is the best man in the city? What do you think of this man's conduct? The boy had to answer immediately, and his answer had to be clever, sharp, and reasoned. If he hesitated, he was beaten. If his answer was foolish, he was beaten. If he was too wordy, the Iren would bite his thumb hard, crushing the nail as a physical reminder to shut his mouth. This constant interrogation created a state of hypervigilance. The boys learned to constantly analyze their peers, to judge their worth, to spy on one another. It broke down trust between individuals and refocused it solely on the hierarchy. You didn't trust your friend, you trusted your commander. They were taught to ridicule those who showed weakness. Humiliation was a tool of social control. If a boy cried, his peers were encouraged to mock him. If he failed a physical challenge, he was ostracized. This created a society where shame was a fate worse than death. A Spartan would charge into a wall of spears, not because he was brave, but because he was terrified of the shame of not charging. All of these years of torment, the hunger, the beatings, the cold, the psychological warfare culminated in rituals designed to test the limits of human endurance. The most infamous of these was the Diamastagosis, the festival of Artemis Orthia. In the ancient times, this might have been a human sacrifice. By the classical period, it had evolved into something arguably more sadistic. The ritual took place at the temple of Artemis. Cheeses were piled high on the altar, glistening in the sun. The young boys were lined up. Their objective was to run to the altar, grab as much cheese as they could, and run back. But standing between them and the prize was a row of older warriors armed with heavy leather whips. As the boys ran, the warriors unleashed hell. They didn't hold back. They whipped the children with full force, the leather slicing through skin, flaying the flesh from their backs. The air was filled with the wet crack of the whips and the smell of iron and sweat. But the air was not filled with screams. That was the test. The boys had to run through this gauntlet, retrieve the cheese, and return without making a sound of pain. To scream was to fail. To cry was to fail. To fall and not get up was to fail. Parents stood in the crowd, watching. A father would watch his son's back be torn open and would shout encouragement, not to stop, but to run faster, to take the hit, to show no fear. Mothers watched to see if their sons were worthy. Plutarch writes that the altar would be soaked in blood by the end of the day. He records that it was not uncommon for boys to die under the lash. They would collapse from shock and blood loss, their bodies broken, but their faces set in a rictus of determination. They died smiling, because they had not cried out. They had defeated the pain. They had defeated their own biology. This was the finished product of the agoge, a human being who could be whipped to death and feel only pride. But there was one final secret, one last horror, hidden behind the shield of Spartan honor. It was the crypteia. If the agoge was the forge, the crypteia was the tempering in blood. It was a secret police force, a state-sponsored death squad comprised of the most promising young graduates of the agoge. These young men, usually around 18 or 19, were sent out into the countryside with nothing but a dagger and the clothes on their backs. They were told to survive on their wits. But their true mission was not survival. It was murder. Their targets were the helots. The helots were the enslaved population that farmed the land, the people who outnumbered the Spartans 7-1, the people whose labor allowed the Spartans to train for war all day. The Spartans lived in eternal fear of a helot uprising. The crypteia was their solution. The young Spartans would hide by day, sleeping in ditches or caves. By night, they would descend upon the helot villages and roads. They were not looking for criminals. They were not looking for rebels. They were looking for the best. They hunted the strongest helots, the ones who stood tall, the ones who were charismatic, the ones who looked like they might one day lead a revolt. The young Spartans would stalk these men in the dark and slit their throats. It was a culling. It was weeding the garden. But it was also the final psychological break for the young warrior. To kill an armed enemy in battle is one thing. It is combat. To creep up on an unarmed farmer in the dark and murder him is something else. It required the total suppression of empathy. It required viewing the helot not as a human, but as livestock, to be slaughtered. To legitimize this atrocity, the Ephors would formally declare war on the helots every single year. This legal loophole meant that killing a helot wasn't murder, it was an act of war. It absolved the young killer of miasma, the spiritual pollution of murder. He wasn't a criminal. He was a patriot. When he wiped the blood from his dagger, he was washing away his boyhood. He was now a full citizen of Sparta, bound by blood to the state, complicit in the great crime that kept their society afloat. For 300 years, this machine worked. It produced the soldiers of Thermopylae. It produced the men who defeated Athens. It created a reputation so terrifying that enemies would surrender before a single spear was thrown, simply because the Spartans were marching toward them. But a machine that runs on blood eventually rusts. The very obsession with perfection that built Sparta became its tomb. The first crack in the armor was oliganthropia, the shortage of men, the ruthless eugenics, the discarding of babies, the late marriages, the constant warfare. It all decimated their population. A single earthquake in 464 BC killed thousands of Spartans, a blow they never biologically recovered from. They were an elite club that was dying out, unable to replace its members. The second crack was stagnation. The agoge created perfect soldiers, but it destroyed creative thinkers. They were rigid. They followed tradition. They refused to change. In 371 BC, at the Battle of Leuctra, they met the Thebans. The Theban general, Epaminondas, didn't play by the rules. He didn't line up his troops in the traditional phalanx. He innovated. He stacked his left wing 50 men deep, a massive hammer designed to smash the Spartan line. The Spartans, adhering to their rigid training, couldn't adapt. The Theban hammer smashed into them. King Cleombrotus fell. 400 of the 700 Spartan citizens present, the core of their entire population, were slaughtered in an hour. Sparta didn't just lose a battle, it lost its future. The illusion of invincibility was shattered. The helots were freed by the Thebans. The economic backbone of Sparta snapped. The city that had terrorized Greece for centuries was reduced to a second-rate power, then a tourist attraction for Romans who came to gawk at the savage rituals of the past. The lesson of Sparta is not one of glory. It is a warning about the cost of perfection. They engineered the humanity out of their children to create the perfect weapon. But in doing so, they created a society that was brittle, cruel, and ultimately doomed. They sacrificed their sons to the altar of the state, and in the end, the state devoured them all. The perfect warrior stood alone on the battlefield, surrounded by the ghosts of the children he was never allowed to be, watching his world turn to dust.